Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and today we're going to be starting a series on the history of guns in the United States of America, as well as, and it's not necessarily the history of the types of firearms, so we will be discussing that. What I really want to discuss is where America's fondness for firearms came from and why a lot of other nations don't quite understand why Americans haven't been able to pass gun control at all. And the simple answer is the Second Amendment. But why did the Second Amendment come? And why was it created? And that's a very complicated answer. Now, I'm just here to tell the story. If you want to do the research, it is very much there. You can look at other YouTube channels like Forgotten Weapons. You can go to various historical societies. And like I said, I'm just trying to tell a story, not write a gigantic paper. Um, so, and this is probably going to take multiple parts because it's a very long story. So, where do we begin? Well, we actually have to begin at the very beginning of colonization in the Americas. And we have to discuss the differences between British, French, and Spanish colonialization or colonization, rather than, and we're going to ignore the Portuguese because theirs is really weird. The Spanish set up a system that was effectively feudalism, but with a giant military controlled by the king of Spain in the New World. So, and prohibiting all weapons from anyone living, any colonist living in the New World. This was because, in their eyes, having the people be dependent upon the crown for their own defense against other colonial empires or any native groups who were none too pleased about being kicked off their land. In their eyes, that would be better because it would mean that there would be less of a chance of a revolt. They also didn't really recognize property rights. Most property was actually controlled from Spain. There were very few property owners who lived in the New World. And the truth is, any high-ranking officials in the New World had to have been born in Spain in order to get it. Which is one of the reasons why Simon Bolivar revolted in just about every Spanish colony that existed. Was because even though he was born into a very wealthy family, he grew up around the less wealthy, but because he was actually born in Caracas in Venezuela rather than in Spain, he wasn't allowed to be in any important roles that were of government that were fitting not only his status but also his education, his upbringing, his intelligence. What about the French system? Well, in the Caribbean colonies, it was very similar to the Spanish system. In Louisiana, and I'm consciously saying it like that instead of how I normally do, but and Quebec, it was those territories were seen as not really important, so they allowed whatever. And the truth is, most French colonization in Louisiana and Quebec was more along the lines of one or two cities like New Orleans and Quebec City and Montreal. But the rest was just trading outposts where trappers and hunters and traders would go in and they would simply trade with the Native Americans, hunt some game, trap some game, that sort of thing. And they had guns. Because Native Americans like to trade for guns, go figure. So that was kind of the French. The British were different. The British decided that most colonization was actually going to be for economic benefit. And all colonization was for the economic benefit of the home country. But the Brits thought that individual companies would make these colonies even more profitable, essentially basing their colonial experiment off of the Dutch East India Company. And they even set up their own East India Company, which winds up kicking the Dutch out of India. So there's that. And later you also have the South Seas Company, which creates a very interesting economic situation in England. But you have each colony having different purposes. For example, the Virginia colony was set up by the Virginia Company. And their goal was to acquire as much land, develop it, and turn it into an economic powerhouse as they could. And they were given a colonial charter. Then there were the Puritans who set up the Massachusetts Bay Company, later Rhode Island, and a bunch of other colonies in the New England area. Then you had the Quakers who set up Pennsylvania. And you have various groups in between, and you even have a penal colony in the form of Georgia. But the British thought that at the end of the day, if a person is considered the owner of the land they occupy, so there would be a way if you went over to the colonies, you would, if you were a free person and you had been able to purchase your way over there, you would be given a grant for a certain amount of land. And the truth was, indentured servants, after they were, after their period of service was over, they were actually supposed to be given land as well, depending on the time period that was done, and a few other things. And there were other ways to get land, such as doing extraordinary service to the colony, etc., etc. And so you develop, number one, a very strong focus on land ownership in the colonies. But the Brits figured, well, if they own land, it's not going to be important to, they're going to want to defend it because it's not just colonial land. It's their land that someone is trying to take, that a foreign power, foreign colonial power, or a Native American raid is going to attack. It's their land, it's their family. So they basically tied the needs of the colony's defense, they tied the defensive needs to the needs of the individuals. And so they permitted firearms ownership. And with this strong culture of land ownership came a very strong gun culture as well, because at the end of the day, we're sitting there thinking, well, I have land, I don't want anybody to take it. And this is why property rights were so heavily focused on in the Americas, and why they're still one of the driving factors of American politics to this day. So this all starts to, I'm going to kind of gloss over a lot of history, but firearms do undergo significant technological improvements between the early 1600s and the American Revolution. You go from wheel lock guns that are kind of unreliable and don't really work in the rain and are, accurate to maybe 25 meters, maybe 30 if you're lucky, to flintlock rifles, which could, with the hands of someone who knew the particular gun well, be accurate up to about a half mile. And there is a good book that I'm sourcing this from, and that's the memoirs of Joseph Plum Martin, who was a Continental Army soldier during the American Revolution, who described a scene where one of the members of his company actually was able to hit someone from extreme distance with a rifle. And this is important to know. In the very early days of the Continental Army, the Continentals had the advantage in terms of what arms they were bringing to the fight, at least in terms of individual soldiers' arms, not in terms of heavy artillery or anything like that. And that's because the Continentals basically all had to self-supply, and they brought their rifles with them. British regulars, which is the origin of the term well-regulated, by the way, meaning standardized, not controlled. And eventually I'll get to what standardized actually means in terms of SCOTUS, because that's actually kind of important. The British regulars were using the Brown Bess musket for the most part. There really weren't that many sharpshooters. However, the Continental Army had an entire brigade of sharpshooters, Daniel Morgan sharpshooters. But the other thing is, not all flintlock firearms were single shot. In fact, pepperbox revolvers had existed since the 1500s, ranging between 2 or 3 shots to some extreme examples had over 20. Leonardo da Vinci developed a 33-barreled gun, which would shoot 33 rounds before you needed to really reload it. There was the puckle gun, which is a very interesting design that the founders knew about, but they never really made any. They almost certainly knew about it. But the puckle gun was really just a proof of concept, and it was an early version of a Gatling gun, if that makes any sense. There was a guy by the name of Belton who designed a flintlock that was effectively fully automatic, though the reality it was more accurate. The more accurate term would be burst fire, because you pull the trigger once and it fired all of its shots, but even if you let go, it would continue to fire. And some people have done recreations of the prototypes, or at least the blueprints, and made a prototype of it. Whether or not it was actually created, that's a whole different story altogether, or at least created in era. That's a different story altogether. But the Founding Fathers and the Continental Congress actually put in an order for 100 Belton flintlocks. They only changed their mind about, they only canceled the order when they looked at the price tag. Then you have the Austrian military, which used the Giordano's air rifle from from the middle of the 7 Years' War to about 1785, when they determined that its upkeep was just too much, and that it was more of a pain in the rear end to use than a standard musket. And the Girodonis air rifle fired out of a 22-round magazine with an air canister that could fire 2 magazines effectively without losing lethality, and it would be lethal up to about 800 meters. The Lewis and Clark expedition was actually outfitted with these guns. And both the Belt and Flintlock was closer to a machine gun, and the Girodonis air rifle was closer to a semi-automatic that a lot of people are debating about in the modern era. And the Continental Congress and later U.S. Congress, nor the presidents, really considered it out of the question for a citizen to own these. In fact, I'll get back to the Revolution in just a second, but in fact, during the War of 1812, a ship captain asked James Madison for permission to fit his privately owned artillery to his ship and take out British merchant shipping or even British naval vessels if he found them. Madison okayed it. He just said, yeah, here's your letter of marque and reprisal. Why do you think we wrote the damned amendment? It's my understanding of his attitude towards liberty, In his eyes, that he probably thought the ship captain was saying, well, I want to protect my cargo. Therefore, I should probably have cannon on my ship. Madison's like, okay, sounds good to me. But back to the Revolution. Even then, there were repeating flintlock pistols and not rifles, but muskets at the very least, and maybe a rifle or two that use the same mechanism. It's questionable whether or not they would have been useful in more than just a proof of concept way or fire slightly faster. But the fact that there were guns that could at least come close to matching modern arms in terms of fire rate, the idea that the founders never really considered that firearms technology could improve when they wrote the Second Amendment is just out of the question. They knew firearms would improve. In fact, they wanted to see them improve. That said, by the end of the war, the Continental Army was using muskets more frequently, simply because Congress was able to start purchasing muskets, and also were given a bunch in a loan from France, if I remember correctly, as well as the Dutch, because the Dutch. So the truth is that at the onset of the war, the majority of the Continental Army self-supplied their weapons. And by the way, this actually becomes a bit of a tradition in the U.S. military to bring your own weapon to war with you. And I'm not exactly kidding when I say that either. Even to this day, if you are in the U.S. military and are allowed to choose a side, and allowed to have a sidearm, you can choose what sidearm it is. Most people opt to use the M9, though there are people who are eccentric enough and choose other firearms. Special forces people can choose the weapons they use for whatever mission they use, or for whatever mission. So if they want to use a Glock for one mission, they can. If they want to use, this, that, or the other thing for a different mission, they can as well. And a lot of those arms are privately owned. And we'll get to the biggest examples of privately owned weapons being used in war in United States history, because there's two. And both of these people who did this were future presidents, too, which makes it even better, in my opinion. So, just looking at the time. Okay, I'm going to pretty much wrap this one up on the early history by stating that the battles of Lexington and Concord were actually started because the Brits tried to confiscate colonial firearms that were rumored to be in Lexington and Concord. Yeah, that went well, didn't it? And that the founders, when they wrote the Second Amendment, they wrote it, and I quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." End quote. George Mason, in his authorship of the Virginia Constitution, wrote that the militia shall comprise the body of citizens, and that by the end of the 1700s, the U.S. had implemented what's known as the Militia Act, which defines what the militia is in terms of U.S. legal code. And the militia shall comprise of all able-bodied males 17 to 45. I think we should update that slightly for the modern era to include, to just say all able-bodied individuals of sound mind, and just leave it at that. But the idea of the Second Amendment was to prevent tyranny, because in the founders' eyes, a standing military was more detrimental to freedom than a foreign invasion. A foreign invasion could be, held off for long enough to form an actual army and an actual military. But there was no need to keep that military during peacetime. It's one of the reasons why Jefferson had to reform the U.S. Navy in order to take on the Tripoli pirates. And of course, people will debate what all of the words mean. What does well-regulated mean? What does militia mean? And they will try and use whatever they will to describe it. But the best way is to look at why the amendment. The best way to figure out what each word means is to look at the era it was written in, look at why it was written, and look at who was writing it. There are arguments to be made that the Second Amendment was designed to allow slave owners to put down slave revolts. That is an opinion. Not necessarily 100% true. However, during basically every period, even into the modern era, a lot of gun control laws have been written specifically to target those of African descent. So there is some credence to that idea. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat it. It's one of the reasons why I don't like. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I hate gun control, is because the truth is it's just vague. It's just racism. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions are always appreciated, and if you think it's worth it, I do actually have a Patreon, so I appreciate any help there. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time. Take it easy. Bye bye.